The year is September the 21st, 1947, and in a quiet, sleepy town of Maine, the King of Horror is born. Now, I might seem a little bit biased in this video. That's because Stephen King was, and is very much still, one of my favourite authors of all time. I credit him entirely for opening up my world to fantasy, thriller, but most importantly, horror. And not just in the written word, but in television shows, movies, and just my general love for everything weird and wonderful. Much like music has had a huge impact on my life, so have many of Stephen King's books. And although he writes in many genres, he most definitely was my gateway drug into horror, as I'm sure many of you can relate to. As I mentioned earlier, Stephen King was born in Portland, Maine in 1947. And this was to parents Donald Edwin King and Nellie Ruth King. But life didn't start easy for King. When he was only 2 years old, his dad actually left the family, which meant that his mum had to raise him and his brother David all by herself. It was through his father that he discovered reading, when he found a book left behind by his dad in the attic. And it was actually a collection of short stories by H.P. Lovecraft, and of course it had a demon on the cover. King read it as a boy and something in his brain just clicked. Family moved around a little due to financial issues, but eventually they did end up settling in Maine when King was around 11. King then attended Lisbon High School in Lisbon Falls, and it was during this time that he helped his older brother David produce Dave's Rags, which was a self-published newspaper. And he actually had to use a machine called a mimeograph. Am I saying that right? A mimeograph? And actually, this is where King's first piece of fiction was published. The piece was called Jumper, and it was a 3-piece short story about a police counselor trying to talk a jumper off the Chrysler Building in New York. And King wrote that when he was just 12 years old. Obviously, being published in your brother's self-published neighborhood newspaper isn't quite the extent of your dreams as a young writer. But luckily for King, he wouldn't have to wait too much longer for outside validation. And in 1965, when King was just 17, Comic Review's fanzines published I Was a Teenage Grave Robber, making this his first independently published story. In 1966, King then attended the University of Maine on a scholarship, and this is where he wrote for the student newspaper, the Maine campus. And it was whilst working at the newspaper that he finally met Tabitha Spruce. King writes in the New Yorker that one afternoon him and some of his friends were having lunch behind the university bookstore, and sitting between two of his friends, and I quote, was a girl with a raucous laugh, red tinted hair, and the prettiest legs I had ever seen. Tabitha apparently swore like a mill worker and had a wonderful laugh. Not only did they have writing in common, but they were both from similar working class backgrounds. Both ate meat, which apparently was quite important, and both were political Democrats. It was later in the fall of 1969 that he fell in love with her during a poetry class. The pair were absolutely besotted with each other, and only a year and a half after meeting, King would purchase a 2-ring set for $15.95 at Day's Jewelers in Maine. And it wasn't long until the couple welcomed their first child, Naomi. And this was the same year that King graduated. King and Tabitha later married in 1971. King was quoted as saying, "I married her because I loved her, and because we got on as well out of bed as in it." Fair enough. During this time, King was struggling to get a job as a teacher, which meant that they had to live off of Tabitha's savings, student loan, and King's income as a labourer at an industrial laundry. He actually sold his first professional short story, called The Glass Floor, to Startling Mystery Stories in 1967. Many of these stories would later be gathered together for King's first collection of short stories, Night Shift. Some honourable mentions from Night Shift: you've got Trucks, The Lawnmower Man, The Bogeyman, which you can actually watch on Disney Plus. Non-spawn, obviously. King was planning to teach high school, but initially he struggled to get a teaching position straight away. But in the fall of 1971, King was finally hired as an English teacher for Hampden Academy in Hampden, Maine. This wouldn't remain his career path for long though, because in the spring of 1974, Carrie was published. Now there's some interesting history as to how Carrie came into this world. King actually wanted to stick with short story writing because this was something he was familiar with, especially when it came to short stories for men's magazines. In On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft, King says, "For me, writing has always been best when it's intimate, sexy as skin on skin. With Carrie, I felt like I was wearing a rubber wetsuit that I just couldn't take off. Most importantly of all, the story wouldn't pay off unless it was pretty long. I couldn't see wasting 2 weeks, maybe even a month, creating a novella that I didn't like and wouldn't be able to sell. So I threw it away." which is kind of crazy given what we know it went on to become. King then goes on to say in On Writing, "When I came home from school, Tabby had the pages. She'd spied them in my empty wastebasket, had shaken the cigarette ashes off the crumpled balls of paper, smoothed them out, and sat down and read them. She wanted me to go on with it," she said. "She wanted to know the rest of the story. You've got something here," she said. "I really think you do." Bloody hell, was she right. She basically fished his career out of the bin as a well-renowned author. Mad. And thanks to the popularity of Carrie, King became a household name all over the world. A quick synopsis in case you haven't read Carrie. I'll try not to give too many spoilers. It's about a shy and withdrawn teenage girl who faces torment and bullying from her peers at school and is subject to her mother's deranged and morbid religious views at home. After her first period, strange occurrences start happening around Carrie, and telekinetic powers boil to the surface with increasing frequency as the story goes on. It's also told in a really interesting way. It's a mixture of like newspaper articles, diary entries, testimonials, letters. I'd highly recommend reading Carrie if you're new to the world of Stephen King and you're not sure which book to start with. But any suggestions, any other suggestions for first-time King readers, please comment below. I'd love to know your thoughts. The book's dedication actually reads, "For Tabby, who got me into it and then bailed me out of it." That same year, in the fall of 1974, the Kings moved from Maine to Boulder, Colorado. And some of you King fans can probably guess what's coming next. Their stay in Boulder, Colorado was actually a little less than a year, but in that short period of time, Stephen King wrote The Shining. King famously stayed at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, which inspired the setting for The Overlook. Published in 1977, The Shining follows Jack Torrance and his family as he struggles with being a recovering alcoholic, anger issues, and just trying to make ends meet as an aspiring writer. And he ends up taking a job as the winter caretaker at the Overlook Hotel. Little do they know, their son possesses psychic abilities, which is actually referred to as The Shining. However, echoes of past tragedies get stronger in Danny's presence, and they begin to take solid form. And Jack becomes increasingly unstable as the evil of the Overlook attempts to destroy him and his family. Personally, I really enjoyed the book. A good old-fashioned horror ghost story, but we can't talk about The Shining without touching on Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, which was released in 1980. It wasn't always seen as an iconic film, and reviews were pretty mixed when it was first premiered. The film actually received 2 controversial Razzie Award nominations in 1981. One was for Worst Director and the other was for Worst Actress. But the latter was actually rescinded in 2022 after Kubrick's treatment of Shelley Duvall on set came to light. Notoriously, King hated the movie. He felt it deviated too much from the books, and I have to agree. Whilst I love this movie, due in part to Jack Nicholson's performance and the overall art style of the movie, the characters of Jack and Wendy Torrance are just so different from the book, it does it no justice at all. And it's a shame because Shelley Duvall could have been amazing in that role. In the book, Wendy's character is much more resilient and strong, but the movie's version of Wendy just wasn't it. And it was whilst writing The Shining that Stephen King suspected he had a problem with alcohol. Not only was it a running theme in this book, but it would play a pivotal role in many of these other works too. And it wasn't long before King reached a point where he was afraid to stop drinking, believing that he'd no longer be able to write if he did. King has said that his drinking problem started after the filming of the adaptation of Carrie in 1976. Shortly after the release, King's mother passed away, fueling his descent into depression and self-medicated drugs and alcohol. Substance abuse became a significant part of his life, and he even revealed that during this time he wrote Cujo. But he was on such a bender that he has little recollection of writing that book. He's quoted as saying, "There's one novel, Cujo, that I barely remember writing at all." I don't say that with pride or shame, just a vague sense of loss and sorrow. I like that book, and I wish I could remember enjoying the good parts as I put them down the page. Another one of his infamous books that he wrote whilst under the influence was The Tommyknockers. In a 2014 interview with the Rolling Stones, King acknowledged that his quality of writing suffered during this period of drug use, saying, "The Tommyknockers is an awful book. This is the last one I wrote before I cleaned up my act." Released in 1987, The Tommyknockers is about a small town that falls under the influence of an object that's buried in the woods, and there's a writer called Bobby Anderson who is obsessed with digging it up. I won't We won't tell you anymore. Maybe you should read it. I know Stephen King wasn't happy with the book, but perhaps it's found a new audience in this day and age because it actually has a respectable 3.5 on Goodreads. But sadly, his drug use became so uncontrolled during this time that he indulged in a cocktail of any drink and drugs that he could get his hands on. King smoked 2-pack cigarettes a day, experimented with marijuana, took Valium, Xanax. He even used Listerine mouthwash and NyQuil cold medicine treatment as a desperate way to get a high. For a while, King would write sober during the day and later edit while drinking at night. He says, as time went by, I started to fumble a lot of the balls. I had a busy public life and a lot of things got a bit ragged by the end. Eventually, in 1987, Tabitha staged an intervention. And she did this by dumping out the contents of his garbage can in front of all their friends and family. And the contents of the trash said everything that she needed to say. According to King, it contained beer cans, cigarette butts, bottles of Coke in gram bottles, cocaine in baggies, Coke spoons caked with blood and snot, Valium, Xanax, Robitussin cough syrup, and NyQuil cold medicine, and there were even bottles of mouthwash. Tabitha threatened to leave if he didn't get sober, but luckily for him, his family, and selfishly us, it worked. King managed to stay sober and his family life and career got back on track. In the decade following his intervention, he published Needful Things, The Green Mile, Bag of Bones, and several other novels. And things were going well for King. That was until June of 1999, when a nice afternoon stroll would turn into a horror story for the author. King has talked about the events of that nearly fatal day in many interviews, so I'll let him describe it in his own words. I set out around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as well as I can remember. Just before reaching the main road in Western Maine, any road with a white line running down the middle of it is a main road. I stepped into the woods and urinated. 2 months would pass before I was able to take another leak standing up. When I reached the highway, I turned north, walking on the gravel shoulder against the traffic. One car past me also headed north. About 3/4 of a mile further along, I was told later the woman driving that car noticed a light blue Dodge van heading south. The van was looping from one side of the road to the other, barely under the driver's control. When she was safely past the wandering van, the woman turned to her passenger and said, "That was Stephen King walking back there. I sure hope that van doesn't hit him." Most of the sightlines along the mile-long stretch of Route 5 that I walk are good, but there is one place, a short steep hill, where a pedestrian heading north can see very little of what might be coming his way. I was 3/4 of the way up this hill when the van came over the crest. It wasn't on the road. It was on the shoulder, my shoulder. I had perhaps 3/4 of a second to register this, and it was just enough time to think, my God, I'm going to be hit by a school bus. Then there is a break in my memory. On the other side of it, I'm on the ground, looking at the back of the van, which is now pulled off the road and tilted to one side. This image is clear and sharp, more like a snapshot than like a memory. There is dust around the van's taillights, the license plate and the back windows are dirty. I register these things with no thought of myself or of my condition. I'm simply not thinking. There's another short break in my memory here, and then I am very carefully wiping palmfuls of blood out of my eyes with my left hand. When I can see clearly, I look around and notice a man sitting on a nearby rock. He has a cane resting in his lap. This is Brian Smith, the 42-year-old man who hit me. Smith has got quite the driving record. He has racked up nearly a dozen vehicle-related offences. He wasn't watching the road at the moment that our lives collided because his Rottweiler had jumped from the very rear of his van into the back seat, where there was an igloo cooler with some meat stored in it. The Rottweiler's name was Bullet. Smith has another Rottweiler at home. That one he named Pistol. Bullet started to nose at the lid of the cooler. Smith turned around and tried to push him away. He was still looking at Bullet and pushing his head away from the cooler when he came over the top of the knoll, still looking and pushing when he struck me. Smith told friends later that he thought he'd hit a small deer until he noticed my bloody spectacles lying on the front seat of his van. They were knocked from my face when I tried to get out of Smith's way. The frames were bent and twisted, but the lenses were unbroken. They are the lenses I'm wearing now as I write. Smith sees that I'm awake and tells me that help is on the way. He speaks calmly, even cheerily. His look as he sits on the rock with his cane across his lap is one of pleasant commiseration. "Ain't the two of us just had the shittiest luck?" it says. He and Bullet had left the campground where they were staying, he later tells an investigator, because he wanted some of those Mars's bars that they have up at the store. When I hear these details some weeks later, it occurs to me that I have nearly been killed by a character out of one of my own novels. It's almost funny. Help is on the way, I think. And that's probably good because I've been in a hell of an accident. I'm lying in the ditch and there's blood all over my face and my right leg hurts. When the paramedics arrive, King is rushed to Northern Cumberland Memorial Hospital in Bridgeton. And King recalls someone yelling, "You really want to hammer it." Whilst in the ambulance, one of the paramedics actually cuts off a ring on his right hand. And this is actually a wedding ring Tabitha gave him in 1983. Not the 2-ring set for $15.95 that I mentioned earlier. Once he's assessed at Northern Cumberland Memorial Hospital, they realize that his injuries are too extensive and they can't treat him there. A helicopter ends up having to fly him to Central Maine Medical Center in Lewiston. And it was during this ride to the next hospital that King recalls not being able to breathe properly. Finally, he gets the attention of one of the paramedics in the helicopter, and they realize that one of his lungs has collapsed. They had to stab a needle into his lung so that he could breathe. And King recalls hearing a shloop, shloop, shloop sound. Luckily, it only takes 10 minutes to get from the Northern Cumberland Memorial Hospital to the Maine Medical Center in Lewiston. It all becomes a little bit overwhelming for King, and all he can think about is how he just wanted a nice afternoon stroll, pick some berries, and that he didn't want to be out for too long. He needed to be home by 5:30 because him and the family were off to see the General's daughter at the cinema that evening. Once he's being taken care of at the Medical Maine Center, he doesn't remember much. Mainly darkness, a mixture of echoey voices, hallucinations, operating rooms, machinery. To be fair, he was pretty dosed up on morphine at this point. Earlier, I mentioned how King recalled Brian Smith guessing he had only a few broken bones. Well, this turned out to be quite optimistic. Are you ready to hear the damage? King's lower leg was broken in at least 9 places. His right knee was split almost directly down the middle. He suffered fractures to his right hip, along with a femoral fracture in the same area. His spine was chipped in 8 places, 4 broken ribs. His collarbone was intact, but the skin above it was pretty much stripped raw, and the lacerations in his scalp took almost 30 stitches to close. So now begins the long and arduous task of trying to heal and recover. And from what I've read, it left King very frail and weak, but it gave him a fighting chance of walking again and living a fairly normal life. It took 5 huge surgeries to put his leg back together again. He had a large steel apparatus on his leg called an external fixator, and this required 8 large steel pins to run above and below the knee to keep it in place. And keeping it locked in place meant that it would heal better. He says the daily pin cleaning that he had to undergo 3 times a day was like having kerosene poured into his leg and then lit on fire. King's recovery continued with physical therapy, and Tabitha ended up renting a condo nearby so that she could visit him more. And apparently every morning she brought him poached eggs and tea. Having entered the hospital on the 19th of June, on July 9th, King was finally able to leave and go home to Bengal. His recovery didn't stop there though. He had to continue with daily rehabilitation programs. And on August the 4th, he underwent another surgery to have that horrible contraption apparatus on his knee removed. The doctors declared that his recovery was on course. And on July 24th, 5 weeks after the accident, King finally began to write again. You may be thinking, what happened to Brian Smith? Was he punished? Did he get away with it? A grand jury indicted him on driving to endanger, but also aggravated assault, which could mean jail time. The district attorney assigned to Smith's case allowed him to plead guilty on the lesser of the 2 charges, the driving to endanger. He received a suspended 6 months jail sentence and a year's driving suspension. And come autumn of 2001, Brian Smith was back on the roads. King says that if he'd hit any other part of the van, aside from the windscreen, or landed anywhere else but the grassy knoll, things would be entirely different. I'll leave the article down below. There's a lot more that I haven't covered here. I didn't want to just read out the whole article, but I definitely recommend giving it a read. Lucky for us, and despite it being a long and difficult journey, King eventually recovered from the ordeal and was soon back writing, which I'm grateful for. Because he went on to write some of my favourite books of all time. That includes Dr. Sleep, Mr. Mercedes, and 11/22/63, as well as finishing the Dark Tower series, which I love. Speaking of the Dark Tower, let's take a moment to discuss one of the greatest fantasy series of all time. And actually, I think The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger, was one of the first books of Stephen King's that I read when I was younger. And I can't quite put into words the chokehold this series has on me. And if you've read the series, you'll probably understand entirely. But the ending, I'm not going to say any more, but the ending, oh my god. From the ever-evolving characters and their relationships to one another, the world hopping, the battle scenes, the final bosses, the love stories, the wonder, and the grief, oh my god, the grief you'll experience when you read the series. And not forgetting that there's a Billy Bumbler called Oi. Now if that's not a reason to start reading this series, I don't know what is. And it's no wonder that it's widely considered to be, and by Stephen King himself, as his magnum opus. In the late 1970s, King began a series about a lone gunslinger named Roland who pursues the man in black across an alternate universe. And that alternate universe is a mixture of J.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth and the American Wild West. The Dark Tower, the Gunslinger was actually originally published as 5 short stories, and these were published in the Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine between 1978 and 1981. And it grew over the decades into an A-volume epic. And if you haven't read it, I would recommend that you do. It's a commitment. It's going to take you a while, but I promise you, it is 100% worth it. Before I finish, I want to touch briefly on King and Tabitha's children. Naomi King, their firstborn, is now a reverend. And from reading Naomi, I'm so sorry, I'm not sure which way they like to pronounce it. But on their X page, they describe themselves as, just so I don't get this wrong, let me read this, a Unitarian Universalist teacher, justice seeker, wheelchair user, yoga teacher, queer and genderqueer, and lover of life. And it seems that Naomi lives a fairly low profile life. They're not really in the spotlight much, unlike their brothers, Owen and Joe. Naomi was actually born with a chronic deficit of the hormone adrenaline. And although a big reader, they found terror a hard emotion to process, which kind of meant that their father's work was a little bit lost on them. In an article for the New York Times Magazine in 2013, King asked them what they do like to read. The answer? Dragons. King then went on to write them a book, The Eyes of the Dragon. This is a fantasy tale of evil magicians, princes, most importantly, dragons. He even dedicated the book to them. That's pretty cool. Imagine having someone in your family that can write you whatever you want. I'd love to have that. Joe Hillstrom King came next, born in 1972. And I'm sure he's an author. I say I'm sure, I mean, I'm the one that writes this, but I will be doing a deep dive on Joe at some point, I'm sure. And there's so much I could tell you in this video, but for now, I'll just kind of give you the main facts. And you might know him better as Joe Hill, which is his pen name. He chose to abbreviate his middle name in 1997 to succeed solely in his own right. He didn't want to be a Nepo baby. And he didn't actually tell anyone his true identity until 2007. This was when he published his first novel, Heart-Shaped Box. He's most definitely an accomplished writer in his own right. And you've probably read or even watched many of his work without even realizing it, especially on Netflix. Have you heard of In the Tall Grass or Lock and Key? And one of my favorite Daniel Radcliffe performances came in the adaptation of his novel, Horns. And then finally, there's Owen King, born in 1977. Following in his family's footsteps, Owen is also an accomplished writer and a television film producer. And you may recognize his name from one of the books that he co-wrote with his dad, Sleeping Beauties. Then in 2020, he was co-producer on the most recent TV adaptation of The Stand by Stephen King. Apparently, him and his dad wrote an exclusive ending for the miniseries. I actually don't remember how it ended. I don't remember it being different. So, some kind of fan I am. Apparently, I just need to rewatch it because I was not paying attention, clearly. In recent years, Stephen King has gone on to publish many more novels, and many authors and fans are astounded at the pace that he writes. He's also very active on social media, and he's always posting pictures of his corgis. It's funny, actually. The whole family really love corgis. I'm pretty sure that Joe has corgis too. I mean, they are cute. I could go on about Stephen King for ages, but I really don't want to overwhelm you, especially with my first video. But of course, he had to be the first author in this series of deep dives. I hope you enjoyed that history lesson as much as I did. I'm excited to get started on other authors. If there's any in particular that you'd like to see, let me know down below. Thank you again for joining me. Bye!